My name is Steve Langdon. I'm from the University of Alaska Anchorage. I'm going to moderate this session. The rich cultural heritage of the Tlingit people is shared in broad measure with two very, very important, significant neighboring groups, and that was this particular session is to bring forward those two groups and have a discussion in part about the nature of those intersections. The title of this session is Our Neighbors, the Haida and the Tsimshian. And our first panelist this afternoon is Dr. Margaret Seguin Anderson. She's an anthropological linguist from the University of Northern British Columbia and has worked extensively on Tsimshian oral traditions and linguistic materials. And many of those deal with relationships with Tlingit. And so the title of her presentation is Visible Grammar, Tools for Revitalizing Tsimshian Sm'algyaxr, which is the term for the Tsimshian language. Margaret.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here in Tlingit country. It's wonderful to see the people participating in the conference and the support and enthusiasm from people of all ages and the knowledge that Tlingit people are bringing out. I haven't seen an event like this quite in Tsimshian territory, but I hope someday we can have one and there'll be as many Tsimshian people making presentations. I'm going to talk today generally. I've given out copies of a paper to a number of people. I only brought 30 copies, but I think there are enough there for most of you to look at some of them later. I could have talked without the technology, but I'm just going to talk generally about the programs for Tsimshian Sm'algyaxr language that are in existence now and where we're trying to go with them. I've been lucky enough to be part of the Tsimshian community since 1978. I was originally invited to do some applied linguistic work in Hartley Bay, which is a small community about 80 miles south of Prince Rupert. And you have to either fly in or go by seaplane or go in by fishing boat to get there. So it's a fairly remote community. And the language was relatively strong there compared to some of the other communities. Some of the Tsimshian communities you probably know are practically surrounded by cities now. Kitsilas and Kitsimkalem and Metlakatla are all in urban areas at the present time. And the language is much less strong in those areas. At the present time, however, the language is severely endangered. The youngest speakers are in their 60s, who learned it as a first language from their mothers and grandmothers. And there are only a few hundred of them. There are more speakers of the related two languages, Nisgat and Gitsenmech, and some of the youngest speakers of those languages are as young as their 40s. But for Tsimshian Sm'algyaxr, the window of opportunity to create resources and to work with the fluent speakers to create a future for the language is very small at this time. 6 years after I started working in the community, I actually married a man from Hartley Bay who was a commercial fisherman. So I got to be more involved in the community and to take part in feasts and activities associated with the cultural life of the community, as well as the research and education parts of the Tsimshian community. The last 15 years or so, the language has been taught more widely in the school system. There's now a school program teaching the language from grades 5 to 12 in the Prince Rupert School District. It was taught in Hartley Bay when I first went there, but it was one of the only communities that had a language teacher at that time. The program, however, can take young people who have that ability to take up a language very rapidly, and they can learn some vocabulary, they can learn some, they can learn to pronounce the language, they can learn to read it in the time available, and they can learn some of the set phrases. So all of the kids can introduce themselves and tell their names and tell where they come from. But most of them are very, very far from any kind of real fluency. So that if they're confronted with speakers who actually try to converse with them, it breaks down very quickly, which is frustrating for the young people as well as for the fluent speakers who want to support them. One of the reasons is that the language is, of course, very different from English. I don't know either Haida or Tlingit, but I do know that Tsimshian, there's a great deal of interconnections between the parts of each sentence, and there are a lot of ways to go wrong. Every sentence you have to know whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. Fluent speakers, of course, don't know they know that, they just know this is right and that's wrong. You also have to know which type of time words you're using, because the patterns that work with the time word yagwa, which is like ing, yagwa yauchka hena'a, is very different than the time word that works with dum, which is to be going to, the future tense, or to I will do it. So the patterns depend on the time words, the type of verb. They also depend on the type of subject in an intransitive sentence. Is it a common noun like hena'a, woman? Or is it a proper noun like Mique'l, a particular individual person? Or is it a pronoun? So before you can even start to say the woman is eating, you have to know those three things and have decided the patterns according to them. And that means just for a simple little intransitive sentence, there are, it turns out, 6 ways to be wrong and only 1 way to be right. And young people, learners, whether children or adults, hate to be wrong. And unfortunately in the culture, and I don't know if this is true for Tlingit, there was a habit of people to teach by teasing and making fun. So that and young people get sensitive if they're being teased and made fun of all the time, which, since they didn't have any way to grasp the patterns of the language very easily and didn't have enough time in the classrooms to learn them, was happening all the time. I'm going to show you a slide now, which, for those of you who have the handout, is on page 18. We got interested in trying to make grammar accessible because there are some grammars of the language. There are several published grammars of Tsimshian Sm'algyaxr. Boaz had one from long ago, a grammatical analysis. John Donne had one that he published in the 1970s, which is a good practical reference grammar. Doesn't go overboard trying to be technical, but it's still pretty difficult for people to get into. So what happens is Tsimshian people, when they look at them, if they're speakers, they look at the examples and work backwards, but they don't get into understanding the structures of the language based on what's presented there. There are a couple more recent grammars as well, but they're even more theoretical and tend to use tree diagrams and be pretty difficult for people to enter. So we tried to create a set of user-friendly grammar resources. I've been working, as I think I said, with the Tsimshian Sm'algyaxr Authority for the last 10 years or so. This is a group of people from each of the communities who come together to do planning for resources, to apply for funding, and to support the teaching of the language and development of new resources. Initially, the Language Authority, I think, was created, as many of them in British Columbia, in response to the BC College of Teachers, which certifies, licenses teachers in BC, indicated that a language authority authorized by a First Nation could recommend people who would then be certified, given teacher certificates to teach the language and culture. So that was the beginning of the Language Authority, was that they actually interviewed people and said that these people are fluent, they know the language, and they should be given teacher certificates. But since then, the Language Authority has gone on and has done a number of activities to support teaching in the language. And one of those is that we've gotten some small amount of funding from the First Peoples Cultural, Language, and Heritage Foundation to develop resources. One of the sets of resources is a set of user-friendly grammar modules that I was asked to author part of them, and Marianne Ignis, who has worked on Haida, Secwepemc, or Salish and languages, and Bella Bella, just an amazing resource, is still finishing up some of the other ones. This is one of the very simple set of graphics that go with the modules on intransitive sentences that show you some of the differences between them and how you have to work with the categories. If you want to say a sentence like "the dog is eating," Mique'l has, the connective, which is in the bright pink color, is an A, and that's determined by the fact that the word that follows is a common noun. That A connective before common nouns works with all the time words. There's no, you don't have to figure out the time words to do that. Before a common noun, it's an A connective in this type of sentence. If you have a proper noun, a word like John, or Mary, I think I've used here, there are two different connectives you use depending on what the time word is. So if the time word is either yagwa, which means it's going on right now, or ke, which means it happened or is going to happen close to the present, then the connective is as. So it would be Mique'l mele. If the time word is either dum, which means will, the future, or na, which is a perfective, means it's already finished happening, na, then the connective is a T, so that you get a sentence like Mique'l John or Mique'l mele. So that what we've tried to do is to represent each of the units in this in different colors. This is an idea that actually came from a linguist who worked on Niska named Mary Lucy Tarpont, and she had suggested doing sentence puzzles, and she actually cut out different shapes because you have some elements in Sm'algyaxr that must always fit in the same order. So for the classroom, she was creating little different shaped and different colored word categories that then students could substitute similar colored flashcards and create new sentences and so on. For Sm'algyaxr, the connective system is a lot more complicated, and I spent weeks trying to cut out shapes and found that it just didn't work. So we stuck with colors, and this works really well. We have a program now where we're training the next generation of language teachers, and that generation of language teachers, we've attracted 25 students. Some of them, a couple of them are actually fluent speakers, and a couple of them had really never heard the language before. So it's a very complicated group to work with. But through this, they're actually managing to learn how the language gets put together, because that's what we found is that with adult learners, and there are no end of people trying to learn, they can learn vocabulary, they can get some of the pronunciation, but they come up to a stone cliff when it comes time to put sentences together or to figure out what sentences mean when they're put together. So if we can represent them visually, this seems to be a way that actually helps them to climb over that barrier so that they can start to understand and more creatively use the language. You know a lot more of the language if you know only 100 or 200 words, but you can put them together. and understand the meanings when they're put together than you do if you know 1,000 or 2,000 words but can't put two of them together meaningfully. So that's part of what we're doing. For transitive sentences, when you've got both a subject, a doer of the action, and an object, of course it gets more complicated. You've got two sets of connectives, and you've got a lot more complexity. So if you wanted to say something like, the man is kissing the woman, this is the pattern for it. Yagwit humtsakte yuta hena. And so that DA is an element you don't have in intransitives, and that T that follows the time word is something that you don't have in intransitives. So it's a different set of patterns. For transitive sentences, where you've got both a doer, the man kissing, and a receiver, the woman being kissed, you've got actually 18 different patterns that depend on the type of subject and object and the time words and so on. That's a lot of ways to be wrong. That's what frustrates learners. And this, of course, is not learning the language. What we're able to do here is to give people the tools so that they can become language learners. But learning the language requires practice, practice, practice. But with this, learners can actually create substitution drills, and they can come to internalize those grammatical meanings. So I'm not going to take a lot more time today. I know this session got off to a bit of a late start. I'm happy to send copies of my paper to people and to discuss the use of this type of learning material. I want to end just by showing you some of the people that I got to work with. We've had several sets of funding. As I said, we got a small amount of money from the First Peoples Foundation, and with that we've done some dictionary work, and we've done some work on analyzing texts and linking those into the dictionary, and those are both described in the paper. And we've also done some work in transcribing texts that had been recorded in the 1960s and 70s and had not been made available to people yet. And these are some of the people that have worked on these various projects, including checking all the sentences in the grammar modules. Marjorie Brown at the back left is from Kitkatla. Janice Skidaw is a student from the local college who helped to do some scanning and other sorts of works. Tammy Bloomhagen in the black is my stepdaughter, who is a language teacher. Typical of the generation that really needs some of this work. She grew up in the house with both parents fluent speakers. Grandparents lived in the community, lived in the house. They were all fluent speakers. Tammy was an only child, but she grew up not speaking the language. She grew up as a great translator. She understood it, but not able to speak it. And that's typical of her generation. And she has, through her work in these courses and with resources, actually managed to break through so that she can now conduct a conversation in the language. So for her and for me, that's been an enormously gratifying part of it. Mildred Wilson on the bottom left died last year. She was a language teacher for 25 years. The language teacher in Hartley Bay died just before I went there the first time. And Mildred took her place and worked for about 25 years. Fred Ridley and Samson Collinson and Velna Nelson are all fluent speakers who contributed an enormous lot. And there are several people who weren't there the day that we took the pictures. So I will close off now. I don't think we want to take time for questions, but I'll be at the banquet tonight and be delighted to talk with people later on.
Now we're going to be hearing from Mr. Tom Abel. I've known Tom for 35 years now. I think the first night when I met him, we started playing basketball together. There's nothing like that to bond people along our coast. He was born and raised in the village of Craig, but his ancestry is from Kegani Haida. And the title of his comments are Reflections on Roots and Resurrections.
my brother Stan here. Stan?
Hello, hello, Tom. I'd like to make a comment that misunderstood, if I may. Sure.
Stan is an old and very valued friend of mine, and Stan is one of the finest Tsimshian Carvers I've ever known, and he's, like I said, a very good friend of mine. Stan.
Thank you. Tom's my good friend. You know, there's a real misconception in the understanding of the Tsimshian language, and it's brought up all the time. And the people don't know how to answer, the Tsimshian don't know how to answer, our younger people don't know how to answer it. When a lot of the people out there say that Tsimshians don't have word for thank you. And that is mentioned all the time. You know, in Tsimshian is a real descriptive language. It doesn't have a word for a lot of things, like, for instance, the floor. What you call the floor? Tsimshian don't call it floor. They call it Mique'l. That's something that you walk on. They tell you what it does. And the table, they call it Mique'l. It doesn't mean table. Mique'l is what you eat from. Haida, that don't mean chair. It's what you sit on. That's the way Tsimshian language is. And then when they say that Tsimshian don't have a word for thank you, what they're saying is the Tsimshian's not grateful about good things that happen to them. That's not true. Tsimshians, when they thank you, they describe like a certain time, like now, I'm going to say thank you to all the people here. But this can't be used on every subject. And when I say thank you to all the people here, I'll say, I want to shake your hand. I like what you're talking about. You're going to make lots of people happy with what you're talking about. That's my thank you, Tsimshian thank you to what's going on now. There's no one word that'll cover the whole thing. Like somebody gives you something, that's a different thing. You know, and the closest thing I can come to when they say thank you, I want to shake your hand. That's a Tsimshian thank you. They don't say one word, they talk of the incident that happens and how they feel. And I like to make that clear, you know, when the people say Tsimshian don't have a word for thank you. What they're saying is Tsimshian is not grateful for things that they do. Tsimshian are grateful people. And I like to make that clearer. Tsimshian say, I feel good when I see you. Thank you very much for your time, and think about that next time. You know, we don't have a word for that. That's an English word. We don't know what thank you means, but we can express our feelings. That's the Tsimshian thank you. You make me feel good in my heart. I'm going to shake your hand. I'm going to shake your hand real hard. Thank you.
Skidaw, Inu Dikion. Skidaw, that is how I'm called. I just recently learned how to say that. I'm stased. I've been instructed on how to say that many ways. In Masset, they call it stas. Our primary crests are the eagle, the beaver, and the frog. Our beaver has a tail in the face and wearing it around my neck. Our clan and my family is descended from Kwakuna, the only sister of Eden Sioux. Eden Sioux is the name of Skidaw's brother. Jimmy Hart is my brother now. We call ourselves Hadalas, good people. Today, we're called Haida, which is an anthropological appellation. I want to acknowledge now my opposite clan, as the protocol that I know requires. Your Klanotts, are you here? Viola's here. Are there any Klanotts here? The Klanotts are our opposite clan, and the protocol that I know requires that I acknowledge and thank you for your presence here as part of my family. My name was granted to me by the elders of my clan in 1985 with an agreement by the Klanotts and Masset. My naming was witnessed by 450 members of my family in Saxman, Alaska. My mother is Mique'l Goldie Abel from Craig, Alaska. My sister, who's no longer with us, told me that we are lucky because we're descended on all sides from warriors. I'm also Irish, and my grandfather, when they told him that he was a Norwegian, he didn't use nice words to say, I'm not a Norwegian. He said, I'm a Laplander. So I'm also privileged and honored to be Sammi. But my mother is Haida, so I'm Haida. We're from Haida, the islands of the Haida. Modern anthropological theories about our origins say that we migrated from somewhere else. Our creation stories tell us that we were removed from a clan with the help of the raven. And I don't remember what beach it was. But I believe that, and I have the privilege and right to believe that. Our creation stories are every bit as valid as anybody else's creation stories. We believe that we are from here, and this is our land. If my words offend or harm anyone, I apologize in advance because that is not my purpose. My purpose here today is to try to tell you who I am, how my family is related to the Tlingit and the Tsimshian people, and to try to tell you a little bit about what I saw along the way as I became who I am today. There won't be any footnotes. And I won't say anything bad about PowerPoint because I have a really good computer at home. I want to talk a little bit about how I progressed along a timeline that paralleled my life. And I say a timeline that paralleled my life because as I began to study Haida and Hada, I learned that we didn't make a big dichotomy, a big difference. There was no big deal about things being then, now, or gonna be. It kind of blended together. And in my opinion, that this made us stronger and more powerful and more able to access the spiritual things and the supernatural things in our lives. I say that we use catalysts to help us get there, but I think all of us here know that our people use things from the earth, and our men of power use mushrooms. People are offended by that sometimes, but I believe that in the past not everyone was allowed to use those things because not everybody knows how to take them. But our people spent a lot of time talking about the supernatural. When my Uncle Jones told me who I was, he said that my ancestor was bored one day and he wanted to go look for something to eat. So he transformed into an eagle and he was flying about. And he saw killer whales swimming around in Dixon Entrance. He said he thought it was something good to eat, so he swooped down and hooked onto the killer whale. The killer whale was way too big and started to take him down into the ocean. This is a real short version, and I can't remember. My Uncle Jones used to take hours to tell it. But he got so scared that he retransformed back into a human, and he was scared, and the killer whale put a bubble of air around him and told him not to be afraid. I'm taking you down to the bottom of the ocean to teach you who you are. And a little sculpin, this is how Uncle Jones would do it. He'd say a bullhead came up, and like that, told him who he was and what crests he had the right to wear. And that's how my knowledge of who I am began. So, with what I've learned today, I don't see that going to the supernatural could exist if we had the limitations of time, because time is put upon us to control our actions and our ability to do things. But when I was 10 years old, I wanted to tell you this story that when I was 10 years old, me and 3 of my friends, all Haidas, were caught digging out a survey monument by the United States Forest Service building in Craig. Steve knows where it's at, and I'm a surveyor. And to this day, that survey monument is off because 4 Haida boys were digging it up. We didn't know what it was, but we knew it was violating the integrity of our land. And from that day forth, until we grew up, we went to war against the Forest Service. Every single day we bothered them. And they chased us every day. But they never caught us. It became a game with them, but to us it wasn't a game. And to me, today, it's still not a game because I've been involved with fighting the Forest Service even today. I was married and still have the privilege to be associated with Ernestine Hanlon, who had a case against the United States Forest Service called Hanlon versus Spartan that resulted in the Tongass Land Management Plan. I've done other things too. I worked with Greenpeace, and some people were really kind of got excited, but we took Greenpeace to see Alaska, and to the credit of our corporate leaders, they met with us. And we are continuing to work with them today. We're now trying to talk to the music manufacturers in the world. There's 750,000 guitars made by one company every year, and every single top of every single guitar is made with wood from our country. These things are important. I went to high school under Sheldon Jackson. I graduated in 1966. And some strange things happened to me there. We asked to go to the junior college library because there weren't very good books in our high school library, and they told us we couldn't go. So we fought for the right to go there. Me, 2 white guys, and 1 Tlingit, Victor Bean from Hunan. We finally got to go to the library, and we got them there because we argued that we needed to have an education. And they finally let us go there once a week. And that's when I began to study Russian America and our history. And I discovered that Russian America was basically a myth. There was no Russian America. The Treaty of Cession transfers what the Tsar of Russia owned and possessed. We have documentation about what the Tsar of Russia owned and possessed. Part of it is contained in a book called Lady Franklin Visits Sitka. She even named the slaves that the Russians owned as their property. They owned about 11 acres here. I'll leave it there. But I wanted to leave you with one quote from Vine Deloria that I had the very great privilege of meeting at the university, at Western Washington University at the first sovereignty conference I attended, which also happened to be organized in part by Harold Martin, my good friend from Cape. But I had the great pleasure of having lunch with Vine Deloria Jr. And from his book, I'm going to say one thing, and I don't want anybody to be offended about this, because he's talking about education. You got to remember that Vine Deloria has several degrees and he's an attorney. The push for education in the last generation has done more to erode the sense of Indian identity than any integration program the government has previously attempted. The irony of the situation is that Indians truly believe that by seeking a better life for their children through education, much could be accomplished. College graduate education, however, have created a generation of technicians and professionals who also happen to have Indian blood. People want the good life, and they're willing to throw away their past in order to get it. The reason I'm saying that to you is because I think that those of you here that have degrees and manage to finish through the white man's education system are doing what he says we can't do. And I think that Vine Deloria would be very happy to see you here. And I want to also tell you that just because I didn't get a degree doesn't mean that I don't think I'm educated. I didn't like going to school. I didn't like going to the classroom. And when I wanted to say just one brief comment about when we're teaching our language to our children. I think that we need to stop teaching them that the instructor can stand up and say, jump, turn around, look up, look down, because those teaching methods are what they use for our children to respond to a command without question. It doesn't have anything to do with learning. It's conditioning. Our school system is based upon the Prussian education system of Frederick the Great. I learned this by reading an article written by a teacher of the year. It was from New York City. He lost his job because he wrote the article. But Frederick the Great said, "If my soldiers were beginning to think, not one would remain in the ranks." I have some more quotes by Albert Einstein about that, but we don't have time for that. And I have like a lot here. We have a lot of time, I could fill it. But some other things that we encountered in our education was that when I was in 5th grade, we had a teacher that socked every single boy in our class every single day, at least once. No matter what, we got socked in the head. Indians, white guys, didn't matter. All the boys got socked in the head every day by Miss Myers. Nobody believed that she was doing that to us because she was the teacher. By now, I hope you're not wondering, what am I talking about? What I'm trying to convey to you here is how I evolved as a person from someone. When we were raised, they were trying to make us assimilate us. They sent me to Sheldon Jackson so that I could be a good, competent Christian citizen. But in my senior year, I made a speech out here to the Tlingit students because I'd managed to get into the library on Alaska Day. The fireworks were burning on the breakwater out here. And I said, "This is your land. This land belongs to the Tlingits. Sitka belongs to the Tlingits." Our whole student body was out there. I thought it was a huge school. But the next morning I was in the president's office and he told me that I must have been drunk. I told him, "No, sir, I wasn't drunk." He said, "Well, what's your problem, Mr. Abel?" I said, "Dr. Armstrong, I don't have a problem. You have a problem." He looked at me very amused and he said, "Oh, Mr. Abel, I have a problem. What's my problem?" I said, "I'm your problem. You taught me to read, and I'm never going to let you forget it." And I think that some of the things I've done when I began, I offended a lot of people because I didn't know how to be polite and I didn't understand the protocol that was necessary to carry with me as a person of who I am. My uncles told me when I was young that I can walk with any man. They said, "You can walk with any man, and don't you ever forget it." But they never told me I was better than anybody. But they told me that no one else was better than me either. So I had enough pride to get that far, but the system keeps beating down your pride. And despite all this, I went to the University of Washington and tried to become an engineer, and that didn't work. But I went back to the university again, and I managed to have some good professors who took me to the university museum, and they told me about all the things that we brought to the world, like potatoes and corn and maize. And I'm going to try to speed up now because I'm going to probably run out of time real quick. Like George Ramos pointed out to us on the first day, 1 minute goes really quick. 2 minutes to go. Look at this guy, he's known me only 35 years, he took me like 2 minutes. Well, I wanted to make sure that I tell you who I am, but I also wanted to tell you that Skidaw had a Tlingit wife, and I discovered that Albert Edward Edenshaw had a memorial pole in one of his houses, in honor of his uncle's Tlingit wife, and the pole was a Deshi Tong pole. I've lived with Tlingit people a lot of my life, and I know a lot about Tlingit clans and the names. So I knew the pole was Deshi Tong. And then later on, when I met Ernestine Hanlon, I discovered that her name is Kasaige. Kasaige is a Deshi Tong name originally, but Kasaige was married to a Haida. And when they brought Kasaige home to Kutsnawu, Deshi Tong warriors lined the hillsides and they're in water up to their necks. When the canoes came in, they lifted the canoe up on their fingertips, passed it to the center of town because that's how important she was to them. She stayed, but they left 2 canoes and the children. And the Deshi Tong decided that the house was too big to contain these new people, so they created a new house called Ankakitang, Klanotts. So today, I'm going to claim the Klanotts as part of my family, because the first Klanotts children were half Haida. And today, I was married to the person who made that happen. I also wanted to talk very briefly about our trees. Our trees are one of the sources of our being and the source of our life. We have now got two means of relating to those trees. And I think that there's been a mistake on the part of some people, and I don't want to take anybody to task or cast any aspersions. But as a culture, as a people, we have a cultural relationship with the forest and a cultural relationship with the trees. It's been said that we now have logging as now part of our cultural relationship with the forest. I object to that and say it cannot be true. Logging is a corporate relationship with the forest. It is not a cultural relationship with the forest. So we have many things to do, but one of the things I want to tell the Tlingit people and the Tsimshian people today is that my Uncle Joan was married to Tsimshian, and my Uncle Joan also told me that the Tsimshian people are very close to our family. So today I have one arm around the Tlingit people and one arm around the Tsimshian people. And I want to tell you that when they came in and said, you're a Tlingit, you're a Tsimshian, you're Haida, they were missing the point. I'm stas. I'm stas. That includes all of us. It transcends what they call us as tribes. And when I got into working with other Indians, I got in trouble one time because I told them, I'm not an Indian. It's hard to stop saying you're not an Indian. I'm not from India. I am not an Indian. You have to convince yourself. The same way we have to convince ourselves. We have all these things that are mislabeling us, like Alaska Native. I have a thing here that will tell you that Native is not a good word. We need to look at these things. We need to call ourselves things that are positive, things that lift us up. Call ourselves Haida, call ourselves Tlingit, call ourselves Deshitan. So today I'm going to say, and I don't mean to insult anybody or say anything against your pride in who you are, but I became tas somewhere along the line. And I keep trying to you have to train yourself. It's really hard to say, and it's really hard to tell other people to say, you're not a native, you're Tsimshian. And I'm going to take a liberty of another 30 seconds because Steve covered up this with my book. And I reminded me of it. But they were talking today about the mathematics in Tlingit basketry. The power of limits, it's called golden geometry. It's based upon square roots of 2 and 5, I believe. I can't remember it precisely. But it's true. But it's a spiritual thing. And it's the reason that our blankets, when you dance a Chilkat blanket, if it's properly made, it looks like it's alive. These are the formula that constitute the mathematics of your body. And it goes clear back to some other spiritual things. The Jewish people, the real Jewish people, believe that there are laws that correspond to the number of joints in your body, and the other body of laws corresponds to the number of days in the year. And as you can tell, I have a lot more. This is the flag of the Haida Nation. I have the honor of working with the guys that started this. It's not a joke. This little flag scares nations. We shut down Weyerhaeuser, the biggest logging company in the world. We stopped them. And when they had their general annual meeting, no one was allowed to speak at that meeting except the Haida Nation. And I had the great honor and privilege of doing so. So don't let anybody tell you that we can't get there. We've been there and we're not going to go back. Hold on.
Now I'd like to introduce our third presenter. Mique'l Icesis Askren is a doctoral candidate in art history of her people. And the title of her presentation is Bringing to Light a Counter-Narrative of Our History, B.A. Haldane, 19th Century Tsimshian Photographer.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. I thought before I begin my paper, begin my presentation today, that since we're the one session that's dedicated to the Haida and the Tsimshian, that I should start a little bit by tying these two talks together. And I just wanted to thank Margaret for I had the privilege of taking the Sm'algyaxr immersion course with her, not this summer, but the summer before, and it extremely advanced my knowledge in the 2 weeks that we were together as a class. And the grammar that she'd shown, and as in its complexities, but once you're in the classroom and it's broken down for you, and it's accessible to anyone that dedicates themselves, and I'm so thankful for all your efforts. And I've been trying to sneak away from my PhD program ever since I took the immersion course to study with Margaret and spend time in Prince Rupert, and hopefully we can do that this summer. Then also, I wanted to thank you for your talk, and I'm really glad that you pointed out that Vine Deloria is wrong, because he is wrong. Because Vine Deloria has written a lot of great work that's relevant to the history of Native American, Alaskan Indian, all of the different ways that we're, as you point out, labeled to Indigenous people. But the comment that he made in terms of us, that Vine Deloria made in terms of Native people not benefiting from education and going off to white institutions and forgetting who they are, well, I'm one of the many, many examples of Native people who go away to university and use that and use the passion and the love that they have for their community to benefit their community. And I've really, through my community's support, have been able to focus my passion, and it has led me to this point in my life where I've decided to get a doctorate in art history in order to reclaim our history. So we've... What should take care of that?
Guilty. That was the time.
Thank you all for staying. I know that dinner is going to be served shortly, so I'm going to try to stick to my time here.
Don't worry about it. Yeah,
Thank you.
We've been waiting for this.
I'll remember. Just do it, huh? Just do it, my mom says.
Yeah.
So first I would like to acknowledge the people who are related to B.A. Haldane, the photographer that is the focus of my research. And I'd like to have them stand and give a huge round of applause, because without their permission I wouldn't be able to do this today. Thank you.
Mique'l?
Yes.
Erma Lawrence wanted to say something real
Okay.
quick. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, dear, but I just want to let you know that I knew Benjamin Haldane. Is this the same person?
Yes.
He used to live in Kazan with the Haidas, and he made us perform a simple pageant, and it was called the Rock of Ages. Very simple. I still have the pictures. I was 8 years old when we did this, and I have the pictures. We're dressed like angels. We're all in white, long hair, and my mother represented the world. Very simple. It's in the church. She came in from the back, and there was an artificial cross up on the stage, which had, artificial dimensions to it, like it's wide. And she came slowly down the center of the church, and she went up and she put her arm around the world and hugged the cross. And then he took pictures of us outside, and those are the pictures I have. We didn't have, cameras for inside. So if I could somehow get these pictures to you, I'd be glad to do it. And just one more thing that is even more important than that. He painted, oil painting, in strips of canvas, you know how wide they are. And I always went to church because my mother was the organist, and I sat there, and then over the top of it was written, Jesus in Gethsemane, and it said, "Oh my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." I read that every Sunday in Sunday school and all of that. I just want to share that with you. I'm sorry I had to interrupt you, Jim, but I'll be glad to share the pictures with you.
I would just like to say that that is definitely not an interruption to my presentation. I couldn't start it any better than that. And just to respond quickly, she's busy talking. I've seen those photographs. I've seen the one of the little kids wearing the winged outfits. It's in the Duncan cottage in Metlakatla, and I didn't know where they were taken, who they were of, and so I'm really looking forward to sharing those with you. So first and most appropriately, I'm going to introduce myself in Sammi, our language. Sugodum Skidaw, Sm'algyaxr dawatwatku, Lek Skig dapteithu, Rachel Askren wasnoyu, Cream Reeve Wassen Sitsu. Don't cry, Mom. I can't look at my mom. Okay. Cream Reeve Wassen Sitsu. Lumgoran Awalnidzen. In Sm'algyaxr, I have shared with you my Tsimshian name. The name of my mother, Rachel Askren, and my grandmother, Corinne Reeve. And I'm here, Tsimshian, from the Eagle Clan of Metlakatla, Alaska. For people who are familiar with the way in which the history of the Northwest Coast has been written, Metlakatla conjures up a particular set of images. These are I'm starting off with the stereotypical images of our community. A portrait of William Duncan, his church in Metlakatla, Native children at his school, pictures of Metlakatla's industries such as the cannery, and images that explicitly express its Christian faith and devotion to the newly adopted U.S. government. Our community, Metlakatla, Alaska, was founded in 1887 by 823 Tsimshian people who, under the guidance of lay missionary William Duncan, migrated from Metlakatla, British Columbia, in quest of government-sanctioned land rights and the liberty to follow undenominational Christianity. In the wider colonial project that followed colonization in many parts of the world, our community was considered a Christian utopia. Photographs and stories of Metlakatla were strategically circulated by Duncan and his supporters, such as Henry Wellcome, in books and newspapers throughout Canada, the United States, and Britain as evidence of its success, the formation of an economically self-sufficient Christian Native community. The dissemination of these materials and later anthropological publications positioned Metlakatla as the epitome of missionization and assimilation of Indigenous people. Today, this depiction continues to dominate our community's representation in the written history of the Northwest Coast. I'm a direct descendant of the Tsimshians who moved to Metlakatla with William Duncan in 1887. My great-great-grandparents, Charles and Sarah Brendable, and Harry and Sarah Lang, were married by him. My great-grandmother, Cora Booth, who passed away when I was 14 years old, attended Duncan's school. This history is recent to our community. Based on my life experiences in Metlakatla and our oral history, it is my opinion that this colonial narrative, which depicts our conversion to Christianity as a complete rejection of our Tsimshian traditions and so-called assimilation into Euro-American culture, has overshadowed the stories of resistance and cultural continuity that persist in our community. The primary objective of my research is to challenge and disrupt this colonial narrative by bringing to light a counter-narrative of Metlakatla's history that was captured through the photographic lens of one of our own people, Benjamin Alfred Haldane. Next slide. This is a picture of B.A. Haldane that was given to me by his grandson, Francis Haldane, in Anchorage. Throughout my life, I've heard aunts, uncles, grandparents, and elders talk about his remarkable music abilities, photography, and the general store that he owned in our community. They referred to him not as Benjamin, but by his first two initials, B.A. It is for this reason that I refer to him as B.A. in my research. Although he's considered one of the first professional native photographers on the Northwest Coast, few publications have discussed his work and none explore his life and career extensively. Adhering to the ethics and protocols of researching in Indigenous communities, I've received permission from BA's family and our council to do this research. As it is also the responsibility of researchers to give back to the communities in which they work, I also hold forums in Metlakatla to present my work at its various stages for their feedback. I'm grateful for their support and encouragement of my work. The images that I focus on in this paper frame BA's imagery and practice as performing strategic acts of what Haida and Denny defines as photographic sovereignty. Although her use of this concept is primarily confined to images taken by non-native photographers, Sinigeni makes space for further examination of photographic sovereignty as it applies to the interpretation of images taken by BA and other early native photographers. Building on Sinigeni's point, I empower the vantage point of both BA and the native people in his images. From this location, I will contextualize his photographs within its socio-political circumstances so as to illuminate the way in which both his practice and imagery asserts a particular type of photographic sovereignty. And this is BA right here. An earlier image from the last one. Of Lucky Wu, from the Klanotts tribe of the Tsimshian, B.A., who is shown here in his role as the director of the Metlakatla Christian Church in 1909. He was born to Matthew and Ada Haldane on June 15, 1874, in Metlakatla, British Columbia. He was 13 years old when he participated in the mass migration which established Metlakatla, Alaska in 1887. 2 years later, his formal schooling was cut short when, after completing the 3rd grade reading material, B.A. was expelled by Duncan, who stated, quote, and this is B.A. himself talking about this experience, there was nothing more for him to learn. Like other missionaries at this time, Duncan tried to keep his native converts at a level of education that would not threaten his authority. However, B.A. did not allow this experience to discourage him from continuing his education on his own. An avid reader with a remarkable aptitude for learning, he taught himself both music and photography from books. BA played the piano, pipe organ, cornet, trombone, and violin, as well as composed orchestral music and translated Tsimshian songs to sheet music. From the time he was a young man until late in his life, he held positions of the director of many bands and choirs, in addition to teaching music and organizing several brass bands in Native communities throughout Southeast Alaska and British Columbia. And that's what he was doing in Kasan. Next slide. Around 1890, when BA was 16 years old, he began his career as a photographer by taking individual and family portraits in Metlakatla, using homes in our community as backdrops. 9 years later, he established a business as a scenic and portrait photographer and opened a studio in Metlakatla with the standard props, backdrops, and floor decor of the period. This is the interior of BA's studio around 1899, and most of the photographs of his that I focused on, I look at the more of the portraiture, although he considered himself a scenic photographer as well. So that's where my analysis is limited so far. But there, in the back of this family, which in the catalog records is just identified as Indian family, because there's so few Indian families. And so I used other images, and I was able to identify the adult, the husband, the father in this image as Matthew Eaton. And in most of BA's images, there is a portrait that is placed behind the sitter, kind of as a way to get people in positions, and also I think to have them pick out, because you can see it's the same type of backdrop, to pick out the type of drop, because he had a lot of them that they wanted placed behind them. Senior Collections Manager at the Royal British Columbia Museum, Dan Savard, has deduced that BA was the lone professional among other Native photographers who were active on the Northwest Coast at this time, such as George Hunt, who is Kwakwaka'wakw, and Louis Shotridge, who is Tlingit. BA was the only one who owned a studio. By the 1890s, Native people on the Northwest Coast were commissioning studio portraits in unprecedented numbers. Those who traveled from various communities throughout Alaska and British Columbia to have their portraits taken in BA's studio may have found additional prestige and meaning in having their images taken by another Native person. Next slide. His portraiture style adhered to the conventions emphasizing wealth and respectability that were commonly reserved for images of Euro-American settlers. And the portraits that I showed today, I'm trying to show as many portraits of identified people, and especially because this is a Tlingit, mostly Tlingit conference, I brought in as many pictures of Tlingit people that have been identified. And in BA's earliest images, and I think it's because they were so new, just like when you create a new piece of artwork, you want to make sure your name's nicely printed on it, and that you have a good record, and then you make more and more, and you just start not caring about that anymore. And so these really early images have the name of the sitter and the date, and they're mostly of Tlingit and Haida people, because he would probably then have to bring the prints to them in their community, where the photographs of people in our community, they weren't named or dated. So next slide. So here's some other photographs with names, and I'm just showing these because I feel that they need to be circulated outside of the museum archives, outside of my thesis. And I also, and you can start hanging around now, I have a sign-up sheet. If I'm more than willing to give copies out of my thesis, both digitally and physically, so if you want to sign up on that, I would love to share it with you. So next slide. So that was my Tlingit slides, and this is my Haida slide. So this is Lewis Jones of Kasan, and this was in 1905. You know him too? That's awesome. So, are you related? I'm hoping, this is what I was hoping, that there would be some relations, some people that recognize him. This is great. You make it all worth, yes?
All of those Tlingit slides they have up there.
You want to go back, Megan? Go back. The Tlingit slides?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
All of George McKay, David Keenan, George McKay was Pickle.
So George McKay was Tequadi, and the other two were Ganhadi. Thank you. So go ahead, next one. Oh, back. Okay, so just a little bit more time on the Haida slide for my loving Haida members of our audience. So next one. This is one of the few images that I have of a Tsimshian person from our community that BA named. And I also, one of the reasons I call him BA in my research is he actually stamped the wooden crates that he put his glass plate negatives with BA Haldane. So next. Yes? Go ahead, go back. Yes? Go back one more? Okay. This, George Hamilton?
My grandfather.
Your grandfather, awesome. Do you happen to be Steve Hendricks' wife?
Yes.
Ah, Steve told me. That's great. Thank you for coming.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, leave it there. Leave it on that one. Okay. So in the late 1890s, BA started teaching music and taking photographs in Native communities in Alaska and British Columbia. In 1903 and 1914, BA returned to the Niska villages of the Nass River, where he had previously spent an entire winter teaching music, to take photographs of what Duncan referred to as heathen festivals. As an early resident of Malakala, BA lived under the Declaration of Residence, 8 rules constructed by Duncan that outlawed the practice of ancient ceremonies and beliefs and made it mandatory to serve the Sabbath, attend school, to be clean, industrious, and honest, with additional rules regarding land ownership and loyalty to the U.S. government. Rule number 5 instructed, quote, to never attend heathen festivals or to countenance heathen customs in other villages. In light of this rule and the 1884 Canadian legislation that outlawed potlatching, the socio-political circumstances in which BA's practice and the people in these images exercised photographic sovereignty becomes apparent. Strikingly different from most of BA's images, the Niska people in these photographs are wearing and displaying their traditional forms of wealth. In 1903, the 1903 image is of a high-ranking Niska family of the village of Lakatsap, known as Greenville. In his study of raven's tail weaving on the northwest coast, Steve Hendrickson has found that this is the only known photograph of a raven's tail robe in ceremonial use. It's right there. At the time these images, or the 1904 photograph and 1914, so these are the other photographs that BA took on the Nass. This is of the village of Gitlet-Damax, now known as Ayanch, of Sm'algyaxr, James Skeena, and his family. Go ahead, next slide. At the time these images were taken, the Canadian law against potlatching had been in place for over 20 years. However, the large amount of eagle down that is noticeably dispersed on the floor, people, and ceremonial objects in both of these photographs indicate that they were taken directly after potlatch or a ceremony. And you can see, especially on the floor here with the cedar bark mat, it's just absolutely covered in down. And then you can see the down dispersed throughout the clothing especially this guy at the end, you can see it in his neck ring. By 1905, colonial authorities viewed photographs such as these as concrete evidence of illegal activities. In a 1907 court case, a group of Kwakwaka'wakw people were prosecuted as violators of the potlatch law using photographs that were taken years earlier as evidence. Thus, the Niska people in these images and BA were putting themselves at risk of prosecution. In the socio-political conditions of both Canada and Alaska, the commissioning and creating of these images asserted their sovereignty to continue to hold and witness potlatches in the face of the potlatch law and Duncan's governance. Living under Duncan's declaration of residence, BA could have also put his home and business in jeopardy as well by taking these images. However, his position as a leader in our community allowed his work to not only flourish against Duncan's authority, but to also strengthen Metlakatla, our community's long-standing resistance. This is particularly evident in his photograph of Edward Marsden and Lucy Kemnook's wedding reception in 1901. This photograph, people from home, which there's a whole bunch in the audience, you can see just by the mountains in the background where this image is taken. It's in our ballpark, what we call our ballpark, where many of our celebrations for 4th of July, our Founders' Day, continue to happen today. This image shows 4 people from our community openly wearing ceremonial regalia, which was prohibited by Duncan. And right there, this is the second of the images where I actually have people's names. This is Solomon Burton, Henrietta Dundas, Alice Mather, Mrs. Adam Gordon, Sr., and Mrs. Edward Chalmers. Edward Marsden, a Tsimshian who took part in the migration from Metlakatla, BC in 1887, had recently at this time graduated from Marietta College in Ohio and was ordained at Lane Theological Seminary in 1897. Against Duncan's orders, he began the movement for a Presbyterian church in our community, which was fully established by 1922. Edward and Lucy's invitation to our community to wear their regalia to their wedding was an outward protest against Duncan, forcing people to give up their ceremonial objects upon being baptized and moving to Alaska. It is evident in this image and BA's photographs of potlatches in the Nass River that his imagery and practice functioned as a dual means of photographic sovereignty from both his perspective as a photographer and from the perspectives of those who he photographed. This duality is also apparent in other photographs that he took in Metlakatla. In 1930, anthropologist Viola Garfield was in Metlakatla for 6 weeks to conduct her fieldwork for her master's thesis titled Change in the Marriage Customs of the Tsimshian. Garfield was intimately familiar with our community after her year-long position as a school teacher in 1922, which, as she claims, is the whole reason she went into anthropology, was after teaching in Metlakatla, and she came back to our community to do her master's thesis. In her observations of our community, she noted, quote, "Many teachers and village heads leave the village without realizing any of the current Aboriginal belief, thought, and practice possessed by the people. They do not know of the night ceremonies with weeping and feasting for the dead, nor of the clan affiliations which color many village activities, especially those of the church." Garfield is the only anthropologist who took an active interest in the continuation of Tsimshian traditions in our community. In her 1930 survey, she recorded the clan and tribal genealogy, Tsimshian name and rank, and the role and their role in pre-marriage, marriage, and post-marriage arrangement of nearly every Tsimshian family in Mique'l. In her thesis, Garfield stated that all the Tsimshian people in Mique'l, quote, preserve their tribal affiliations so that any individual can give both his clan and his tribe. BA's photographic practice supports Garfield's findings since his images were used by people in our community as well as BA himself to assert their clan identity. This is a self-portrait that BA made in his studio. In a self-portrait made around 1899, BA represents his career both as a photographer and a musician and declares his Tsimshian identity. Placing himself at the center of the composition, BA is flanked by photograph equipment on his left, including a large camera, which you can see in the corner there, and a tiny little brownie camera right here, just outside. Its case is right here, and the camera's right there. And that's a lantern, magic lantern. They used to show slides. And on his right are objects related to his love and teaching of music. That big megaphone-looking thing. And then right here, this is a gramophone. And these are all the gramophone records. And I found an image, which I haven't been able to get a copy of the original, in Challenge the Wilderness. There's an image of people inside BA's studio listening to the gramophone. Although BA had a variety of props, next slide. Although BA had a variety of props he could have used to hold himself up with, he chose to visually connect to his body a model totem pole with his Lahivu Wolf Clan crest represented by the bottom figure. Right there, I zoomed in on the image, and that's the pole. In this image, BA confidently positions himself as physically and metaphorically supported by our cultural values and beliefs. This is also a picture taken in our community by BA. In his portrait of two little girls, a model totem pole has been placed in the center to make an explicit visual reference to their clan lineage. The placement of the crocheted garment over the chair in front of the model totem pole conceals the other figures, emphasizing the children's connection to the crest represented at the top. In another of BA's images, also taken outside of a home in Mique'l, a young boy is shown dressed in a button robe and holding a paddle. The strings of beads hanging off each side, and you can see we can see one really well hanging right there, but there's a big row of them on both sides. These beads indicate its use as a dance paddle, or in dancing. Its large size, along with the adult size button robe, suggests that these items are handed down to him, probably by a matrilineal uncle, as is protocol for the inheritance of Tsimshian men. Next. Unlike the reoccurring props seen in BA's studio, it is clear that the families who commissioned these images brought with them carvings and regalia for documentation by this new form of visual record. These images are visual testaments to the fact that adherence to clan protocols and participation in cultural traditions continue to be transgenerational in our community after our move from British Columbia. Go ahead. BA's photographs were also used by our community to assert ceremonial and hereditary rights. And this is an image of Sidey Campbell. Sidey Campbell was a young boy when Duncan first arrived on the northwest coast of British Columbia in 1857. He participated in the migration to Mique'l along with the 823 other Tsimshian people. of the Giswitwada killer whale clan of the Gitindochs tribe of the Tsimshian. Sidney's Sm'algyaxr name was Nishlut, which was given to him during his initiation in and activities as a Gitsonk at Port Simpson, British Columbia. An exclusive society of carvers, the Gitsonk made objects imbued with supernatural powers to be used in the ceremonies of secret societies. Sidney is one of the few documented members of the Gitsonk. BA photographed Sidney as he continued to carve ceremonial objects in Metlakatla, including this full-size totem pole, as in this image taken in 1905. There's no evidence that this totem pole was raised in our community. However, Sidney raised two fully carved and painted totem poles in Ketchikan. And this image was taken around 1935 in front of the Knox Brothers Curiosity Shop. And there's a sign, it's really hard to see in this image, but there's actually a sign right here that says carved by Nishlut and his native tribesmen. Can't get better clue than that, huh? So, the creation and raising of these totem poles occurred at least 70 years before this practice was thought to have been revived in our community. But Garfield utilized Sidney's knowledge in her 1930 fieldwork. As the majority of our community were fluent in Sm'algyaxr at this time, Josephine Hayward, shown here with Sidney, was her translator. And this is Violet Garfield herself and with Sidney. In each of these images, Sidney is holding a different model totem pole, both of which are similar in style to the full-size totem poles he carved in Ketchikan, or he raised in Ketchikan. The three model poles in the center, right here, continue to be held in his family's collection in Metlakatla. I just photographed them recently, last summer. This one belongs to his niece, Marnell Berthold, his great-grandniece, Marnell Berthold, Solomon Guthrie, and Gilbert, or Dinks Dunn, owns this one. Next slide. And I just included these images a couple minutes ago to show you just some of the similarities between these model totem poles and the totem poles that were in Ketchikan, especially in the teeth, like just the way that Sidney carved these really long, exaggerated, flat mouths. And also, it's not apparent in this slide, but it'll be in the next slide. He's got a very distinct painting style as well. So go ahead. Around 1910, BA photographed Sidney and a group of men with whom he shared his Gitsong teachings. And this is in an area on the outskirts of our community. I actually think it's out by Yellow Hill. In this image, Sidney, who is the fourth person on the left, is shown wearing an amhalite, which is Sm'algyaxr for a chief's headdress, a painted hide or canvas apron and leggings, and a gusnapala, a button robe. This is Sidney right here. And he was identified in this image by a teacher who was working with Duncan at the time. And I've yet to really find a lot of information on how they collected this image, but I think it was going to be used against him. In another image of Sidney, taken around 1880, and if you go back to the last slide, these other men that I've identified are also from using other images that family members or have actually the people have been recorded. And also, one thing that makes this photograph really unique is that three of these men are just before this image or at the same time were on our council. In another image of Sidney that was taken around the 1880s, before our move from British Columbia, he's shown wearing the same apron right here, same exact apron and leggings, and amhalite, the headdress, but the robe is different. This image shows that Sydney brought over his ceremonial regalia from British Columbia despite Duncan's demands. The remote location in which BA took this photograph compared to his images of the people in regalia at Edward Marsden's wedding alludes to an effort of Sydney and these other men to remove themselves from the public, which is protocol of Gitsong during their ceremonies. Oh, go to the next slide. I also just wanted to show too that I think that Sydney painted these tunics because that same really elongated mouths appear on the designs, and this really splotchy painting is also the way in which the figures are painted. You can see it right there, and especially on this one. And these well, you can't see them that well, but there are similar painting on those hats. So, next slide. While the ceremonial activities of Sydney and these men were purposely kept in secret, other people in our community made it their objective to publicly reinstate their hereditary positions as chiefs. Between 1924 and 1925, which Duncan died in 1918, a missionary and teacher who had worked closely with Duncan, Matilda Minthorne, corresponded with Henry Welcome, one of Duncan's most influential supporters, concerning the movement in our community to reestablish our hereditary chiefs. Reporting to Welcome about these activities in a letter written on January 31st, 1925, and you'll have to excuse me because it's really gossipy, and that's just the way she wrote. But there's very important information in here, even if it's a he said, she said kind of thing. Mrs. Hudson told me that Moses Hewson had spoken to them of the fact that his tribe had offered to choose him for the chief in place of Alfred Atkinson. These are all men in our community. That tribe, almost in body, went to the Presbyterian Church. This looks like a scheme of Marsden's to cripple Mr. Duncan's church or to combine the two. They tell me that when Mr. Duncan was leaving Fort Simpson to begin the new colony of Old Metlakatla, that this tribe was not intending to go, but an epidemic of smallpox broke out and they fled to Mr. Duncan for refuge. They came without conviction and were never willing to give up under his teaching or drop the office of chief. Of course it affects others too, she writes, and Joseph Hayward, whose father gave it up under Mr. Duncan, is now desiring to claim his station in line. And this is Joseph Hayward, a photograph that he commissioned from BA. Joseph Hayward, who was 14 years old when he came to Metlakatla with his mother, who he identified to Garfield as sister of Zao, Kitkatla chief of the Gishputwada Killer Whale clan. Garfield also documented that in 1919, Joseph went to his mother's village of Kitkatla, BC, in order to receive his uncle's name and chiefly position. In the mid-1920s, BA photographed, and it's this image, Joseph in Metlakatla wearing his amhalite, his gushhalite, and holding 2 raven rattles. Joseph's commissioning of this image substantiates my argument that BA's photography was used by members of our community to validate their clan lineage as well as their hereditary positions such as chief or ceremonial rites such as those of Sidey Campbell as a Gitsong. Thus, BA engaged his practice and imagery as a mutual means of photographic sovereignty, which he and the people he photographed incorporated into their cultural practices as a complex and subversive means of resisting colonial authority. Next slide. When I began my research in the summer of 2005, only a few of BA's photographs remained in our community. Most of the memories shared with me by elders and his family members involved grief over the loss of his images in house fires and by people who unknowingly discarded them in the fires of our local waste facility. We have a tradition of burning the important personal belongings of loved ones who have passed away. Many of BA's photographs have made this journey. In 2003, 263 glass plate negatives were salvaged from our local waste facility in Mique'l by Dennis Dunn, one of our community members. And these are just 3 examples of those negatives. These negatives are portraits taken in BA's studio around 1910 of men, women, and children. Their edges have been scarred by the heat and flames from which they were rescued, traces of which act as permanent reminders of our near loss of this rich source of our history. They are now housed in the archives of the Tongass Historical Museum in Ketchikan, and we're very thankful for their involvement. Next slide. I have been able to locate some of the prints made from these negatives in the National Archives and the Alaska State Library, and this is just one example. This is the negative that was taken out of the fire, and then this is the one that I was able to find the same copy or the same image in the National Archives. In 2005, I sought and received permission from our council to relocate 14 wooden crates of glass plate negatives from storage facilities in our community to be housed in the archives of the Tongass Historical Museum until we have our own museum, which will be as soon as I'm done with my doctorate. I've also been able to bring a corpus of BA's photographs back to our community in the form of digital copies from collections and institutions and museums across North America. Within the last 30 years, there's been a great resurgence of potlatching, totem pole raisings, dancing, and other Tsimshian traditions in our community. This shifting ground has brought up many unresolved issues concerning the effects of colonialism on the people of Mique'l. For the generations who have internalized the colonial narrative of our history, insecurity has developed that our cultural knowledge and connection to our traditional ways are not as strong as those who remained in Canada. Next slide. On February 28th, 2006, I brought the images that I have discussed in this paper home for the first time in a digital presentation. And that's in our council chambers. Among the over 50 men, women, and children in attendance, there was a strong response of pride in the visual affirmation of the ways in which our ancestors strengthened and maintained Tsimshian cultural traditions, values, and beliefs in our community. In response to my presentation, BA's great-grandson, carver and artist Wayne Hewson, responded, quote, "It made me proud of the fact that my grandfather helped to record history, not just ours, but all of the people he traveled to, and that he continued to attend potlatches. In our family, the descendants of the Haldane women, we were always told by our mothers that we are are from the Killer Whale clan of the Gitlan and to be proud of who we are. These photographs show that our people were proud and we did not give up our culture. Wayne has eloquently expressed my hope for how my research will function in our community. After viewing BA's photographs and learning the findings of my research, he has reflected back on the clan and tribal identity that his mother, grandmother, and aunts made integral to the identity of their children. I hope my research will encourage others in our community to do the same. By acknowledging these cultural teachings and knowing Metlakatla's history from our ancestors' perspectives and being aware of the inherent biases of its dominant colonial narrative, I believe that our community can strengthen our cultural traditions by recognizing its persistence. This does not discredit the dedication of those who are leaders in what we've considered the revival of our culture, but it shows the potency of their efforts as a part of a continuum. My research on BA's photography is a way of repatriating his work back to our community, restoring names to these beautiful people, families, and children, and empowering our voices by placing them at the forefront of our history. Thank you.
But I want to express my thanks to the panel. We had some marvelous presentations, and with regard to the last one, I'm really delighted and honored to be able to hear the narrative coming forward. There are many other narratives that can be written to put Mr. Duncan in his appropriate place, shall we say. One thing that I would love to see done is an extraordinary research on David Leask. David Leask acted as the transitional go-between between the chiefs who basically told Mr. Duncan what to do with regard to the movement of the lands. And David Leask's life is out there begging for an account too, so maybe we'll move on towards that. Thank you so much.